Chapter 2. Laid out on uneven ground along a rocky bluff, Troy is a city of 4 square towers topped by untidy storks' nests, each as tall as a man, of dovecotes, cisterns, yards where black goats are penned, and in a maze of cobbled squares and alleys, houses of whitewashed mud brick and stone, cube-shaped and with open stairways that at this hour mount to dreams. On the flat roofs, under awnings of woven rush, potted shrubs spread their heavy night odours, and cats of the haughty, small-skulled breed that are native to the region prowl the parapets and yowl like tormented souls in their mating. Tucked in between rocky outcrops, there are kitchen gardens, with a fig tree, a pomegranate, a row or two of lettuce or broad beans, a clump of herbs where snails the size of baby fingernails are reborn in their dozens after a storm, and hang like raindrops from every stalk. Here for 11 nights another man has been wrestling with dark thoughts as he lies sleepless on his couch. But sleepless in this case, like so much else in his life, is a manner of speaking. It is what he feels is proper to his grief. In fact, he has slept, but so fitfully, picking his way past eddies of murky flame and corpses, heaped in piles round fallen archways or crammed into wells, that when he wakes it is to a deeper exhaustion. The grief that racks him is not only for his son Hector, it is also for his kingdom, ravaged and threatened with extinction, for his wife Hecuba, and the many sons and daughters, and their children, who stand under his weak protection, and for Troy, once a place of refinement and of ceremonies pleasing to the gods, now in the waking dream that night after night troubles his rest, a burnt-out shell, whose citizens, though they believe themselves quietly asleep and safe in their beds, are the corpses he moves among, headless, limbless, savagely hacked, hovering about by ghostly exhalations and the fires of the dead. Flies cluster at their nostrils and the corners of their eyes. Dogs lick up the splatter of their brains, gnaw at their shoulder bones and skulls, and on the small bones of their feet. Above, among towering smoke trails, birds of prey hang waiting for the dogs to be done. Priam groans, and the chamber servant on his cot at the entrance starts awake. "No, no," he calls, but weakly. "It is nothing. There is nothing I need." The servant settles. The room falls still. But something now is different. The air, as in the wake of some other less physical disturbance, shimmers with a teasing iridescence. Priam comes to attention. He knows from long experience what is expected of him. Stays ready but still. Often, in the lapse of light in the chamber where he sits nodding, or in a leisure hour beside the fish pond in his gardens, one or other of the gods will materialize, jelly-like, out of the radiant vacancy, an old dreamlike passivity in him that he no longer finds it necessary to resist will dissolve, and the boundary between what is solid and tangible in the world around him, mulberry leaves afloat on their shadows, the knobby extrusions on the trunk of a pine, and the weightless medium in which his consciousness is adrift, where the gods in their bodily presence have the same consistency as his thoughts. 2 of his children, his daughter Cassandra and the high priest Helenus, have inherited his powers, but in a form that sets a question against them. For all his reverence, he might say, as a necessary part of it, he is wary in his dealings with the gods, who do not always act openly, or so he has discovered. He treads lightly in their presence. Cassandra, enraptured and pure, has none of his pious trepidation. Poor child! Her brothers taunt her without mercy, seeing in this half-crazed mystic and self-proclaimed bride of Apollo a girl who has always claimed too much for herself, a practiced attention-seeker, and Priam is inclined to agree, but is too fond of the child to speak openly against her. Intoxicated, overwrought, in service to a deity who takes her physically, or so she believes, in a swath of flame, she alarms her father with the hot thoughts her god has breathed into her mouth, some of which, however terrible he finds them, he cannot wholly dismiss. Helenus, by contrast, is Apollo's consecrated priest. What exists quite naturally in Priam as an aspect of daily being, and in Cassandra as half self-induced hysteria has in Helenus taken a sleek professional form. Austere and commanding, but entirely conventional, he is a man, Priam feels, who is too comfortable in the flesh. Only in Priam has what is both a blessing and an awful responsibility remained close to the source. His nature is open at any moment to presences in the air around him that, when they settle out and take a bodily form, have the names of gods. So it is now, seated on the edge of his couch, what Priam catches out of the corner of his eye is the hem of a vanishing garment, and on the air in the last breath of a message he is now to fix his mind on and recall. He is obliged in his role as a king to think of the king's sacred body, this brief 6 feet of earth he moves and breathes in, aches and sneezes and all, as at once a body like any other and an abstract of the lands he represents, their living map. Holding in his head all the roads that lead out to the distant parts of his kingdom, he feels them at all times as ribbons tied at the center of him, for the most part loose, but sometimes stretched taut and pulling a little, according to what is occurring out there, events that his body is aware of as a dim foreboding long before the last in a relay of messengers, who for days have been running down the dusty roads, burst in and deliver it as news. He has 2 or 3 times during his reign gone with a train of companions on a progress through his far-flung territories, to show himself and to see a little of what is out there that he represents. But his more usual role is to stand still at the center, both actual and symbolic in the same breath, and to experience those dual states quite naturally as one. As now when from high up in the coffered ceiling of his chamber he catches an echo of what in other circumstances might be words. After 11 days of watching and silent prayer, in which no food and not a drop of wine has passed his lips, a response. His son Hector had fallen before his eyes. From a bastion on the highest point of the city walls, he had looked on helpless as Achilles, working quickly, like a man under instruction from his daemon, or following the contours of a dream, dragged the corpse to the car, secured it, knot after knot to the axle-tree, and hauled it off through the tumbling dust. Half mad with grief, he had broken from the scene and rushed down to the Scaean gates, meaning to do what, he hardly knew, and when Pammon and Helenus caught up with him and drew him back, had sunk into the earth and straw of the public street, and with howls that in their pain and desolation must have seemed bear-like, fouled his head with excrement, that filth his crown, his only crown now, as the gods clearly intended, so that when they looked down, those high ones, they would see with no possibility of disguise what they had accomplished. This ancient doll they had set up, and for so long prized and flattered, reduced once more to what he had been when they first reached down and plucked him out, an abandoned child, all grimed and stinking. A child now with 70 years on his back, and all that lies between, the extravagant pageant of his days as Priam, king of Troy, a mockery, as they had all along been intended. No, Priam, you are wrong. He stares, and when he turns and looks, his eyes dazzle. Seated close by him on the couch is the goddess Iris. She is smiling, indulgently, he thinks. The soft light she appears in has a calming effect, and his heart opens to what she whispers in his ear. Not a mockery, my friend, but the way things are. Not the way they must be, but the way they have turned out, in a world that is so subject to chance. Chance? He had spoken the word aloud. Again the servant stirs. Priam turns quickly to the place, afraid that if the fellow wakes and calls, the dreamlike spell that is on him may be broken. And in fact, when he turns back, though her words continue to drop directly into his thoughts, the goddess is gone. Only the last of her is shining in the room, and he wonders, he is by nature doubtful, if even this is only an after-effect of his waking. But where else could such a dangerous suggestion come from, if not from an immortal? One of those who are free to raise blasphemous questions, because in being just that, immortal, they will never be subject to what might follow from the answer. Chance. Bewildered but also strangely excited, He sets his feet to the pavement and feels about for his slippers. His mind is as clear now as if he had slept for the whole of these 11 days and nights, and woke entirely restored, his spirits quickened and the light expanding in him. He sits very still, his shoulders in the spare frame a little sunken, and the picture that forms before him is of himself, seated just as he is here, but in full sunlight, on the crossbench of a cart, a plain wooden cart, of the kind that workmen use for carrying firewood or hay, and drawn by two coal-black mules. He himself is dressed in a plain white robe, without ornament, no jewelled amulet at his breast, no golden armbands, or any other form of royal insignia. On the bench beside him, the driver of the cart is a man not so old as himself, but not young either. A bull-shouldered fellow he had never seen before, in an ungirdled robe of homespun, a bearded, shaggy-headed fellow, rough but not fearsome. Behind them, the bed of the wagon is covered with a wicker canopy, and something there is shining out under the plain white cover. Gold, or bronze it must be. It is pouring out light, but he knows what it is. No need to lift a corner of the cloth and look underneath. Quickly he rises, and passing the servant, who this time does not stir, swings open the door to his chamber and begins down the corridor. Hecuba, he mutters. His blood is racing. This is good news. It is for Hecuba, though he fears already his doubting nature again what her response will be when she hears his plan. Outside, the corridor is dark, save for braziers set at an easy arm's reach along the wall and extending at intervals to the distant portal. The effect is of a black flood that has risen above head height, thick, solemn, lapping at the flickering redness of the upper walls, so that the stepping out into it, what he feels is an unaccustomed lack of ease. He, for whose convenience everything here is arranged by the conscientious forethoughts of stewards and the labour of 100 slaves. Here and there, as he passes, the faces of servants who sit backs to the wall at this or that chamber entrance loom up in the dark, startled to see him at this hour, and unattended. They stir and mutter their usual courtesies, but he is gone before they can stumble to their feet. Yes, yes, he thinks, all this I know is unprecedented. But so is his plan. This plunging at near dawn down a deserted corridor is just the beginning. He will get used to the unaccustomed. It is what he is after. He feels bold now, defiant, sure of his decision. If he is to face Hecuba and prevail, he has to be. He finds her already risen and sitting, very erect, on the daybed in her sitting room. A cruise lamp is burning at the top of a tall copper stand. At her feet a pot of embers. She suffers from the cold, throws out a feeble warmth. She too has not slept. Her hair is awry. That is what he sees first. But as soon as she catches sight of him, with her old pride in her beauty, and the wish as always to appear at her best before him, her hand, in a gesture that, like everything she does, is precise, controlled, with its own practical elegance, goes to the bodkin that holds it, and in a moment all is restored. He watches, says nothing. Moved again by the tenderness they have so long shared, he seats himself beside her, and takes her hand. It is no longer white now, but veined and mottled like his own, with liver-coloured spots, and the flesh between the fine bones which his fingertips gently feel for, puckered and slack. He raises it to his lips, and she casts a piteous look upon him. Her eyelids are swollen with tears. "Hecuba, my dear," he whispers, and she allows herself almost girlishly to be held and comforted. They sit a moment, holding one another, like children. The lamp flickers. She weeps. When her tears have come to an end, and she has once again taken control of herself, he begins. "My dear," he says softly, "it is 11 days now since Hector's death, and we have done nothing, all of us, but weep and sit stunned with grief. I know I have wept, and I see from this that you are still full of tears. And how could we do less, any one of us, for such a son and brother, such a fearless protector of Troy and its people? And you most of all, my dear, who have lost so many sons in their last terrible years." He has much to tell her, and wants to lead up to it slowly. He wants her to see the plan he is about to lay before her, not as something desperate and wild, but as the result on his part, though it is not, of course, of consideration and careful thought. But the look she casts upon him is so fierce that he draws back and cannot go on. He feels the hard purpose he has come with flutter in him and fail. Tears, she mutters almost to herself. Oh, I have plenty of those, but not of grief, of anger, fury, that I am a woman, and can do nothing but sit here and rage and weep, while the body of my son Hector, after 11 days of nights, is still out there on the plain, unwashed, unanointed, and 11 times now their noble Achilles has dragged him up and down before the Greek ships. My son, my dear son Hector, and tumbled his poor head in the dirt. Oh, if I could get my hands on that butcher, I would tear his heart out and eat it raw. Priam quails before the small, fierce, straight-backed woman he has known and not known for so many years. I carried him, she whispers. Here, here. And her clenched fist beats at the hollow under her heart. It is my flesh that is being tumbled on the stones out there. 7 times now I have grieved for my son lost in this war, a son lost in this war. And what I remember of each one is how they kicked their little heels under my heart, here, just here, and the first cry they gave when I yielded them up into the world, and the first steps they took. Troilus was very late in walking. Do you recall that, Priam? You used to tempt him with a little dagger you had, with a dog's head on the handle. Do you recall that? And she searches his face for a response. I was in labour for 18 hours with Hector. That is what I recall when I think of his body being tumbled over the stones and left out there for the dogs to tear at and maul. Priam shakes his head. This kind of women's talk unnerves him. It is not in his sphere. He is remembering nothing of a dagger carved like a dog, or that his son Troilus had been slow to walk. What he recalls is a series of small, sprawling bundles, each one presented to him like a bloodied human offering on the outstretched palms of an attendant, to be recognized as his and blessed and gathered into his household. What he recalls is that Troilus is dead, like so many of his sons, like Hector. This talk of dogs' heads and daggers has diverted him from what he has come to tell her, and it makes it difficult for him to begin. But after a moment of quiet restraint, he does so. Hecuba, he ventures, after all this time, these 11 days of doing nothing but weep and think again, I have come to a decision. No, let me finish. You can make your objections. I know you will have objections afterwards, when I have had my say. I am too old, I know, to put on armour and go to the field, to ride into a fray and leap down from my chariot and crack heads and sweat and get bloody. And the truth is, I never was a warrior. It was not my role. My role was to hold myself apart in ceremonial stillness and let others be my arm, my fist, my breath too when talk was needed, because outside my life here in the court and with you, my dear, where I do like to speak a little, I have always had a herald at my side, our good Idaeus, to find words for me, to be seen as a man like any other men, human as we are, all of us, would have suggested that I was impermanent and weak, better to stand still and keep silent, so that when old age came upon me, as it has at last, the world would not see how shaky my grip has become, and how cracked and thin my voice, only that I am still here, fixed and permanent, unchangeable, therefore unchanged. Well, you know I am changed, my dear, because from you nothing of what I am, or almost nothing, is hidden. To others I am what I have always been, great Priam, but only because they have never really looked at me, and when they do look, what they see is what they are meant to see, the fixed mark to which everything else in the kingdom refers, a ceremonial figurehead that might as well be some stone or wood. So to come at last to what I want to tell you. This morning, as I was sitting quietly on my couch just after waking, a vision came to me, not quite a dream, and taking a good breath he begins to paint for Hecuba how he had seen himself seated in a wagon drawn by 2 black mules, plainly dressed in a white robe and with none of the signs of kinship upon him. No amulet, no armband, or any other kind of regalia. Just recalling now, allowing the lines in the pictures to grow clear as he adds one detail and then the next, makes him more certain than ever what he intends to do is what he must do. But to Hecuba, the image is a shocking one. She is more tied to convention than she believes, and as Priam warms to the subject, she grows more and more disturbed. What Priam is speaking is of a dream. Dreams are subtle, shifting. They are meant to be read, not taken literally. Hidden away in what they appear to present are signs that must be seized on by a mind that can see past mere actualities to what hovers luminously beyond. She has spent all the years of their marriage dealing with these visions that afflict him. She prepares now to reply as she normally would, but Priam prevents her. "No, no, my dear," he insists, "I am not finished." And the firmament of this, which is unusual, makes her pause. She goes on quickly to describe the driver. He goes on quickly to describe the driver who sits beside him on the bench, the wickerwork canopy over the bed of the wagon, the load they are carrying. "It shines out," he whispers, his voice touched with wonder, as if the wagon were actually there in the room with them, "from under the plain white coverlet. And though I cannot see it," he blinks. He is very aware of her stopped breath. "Though I cannot see it, I know what it is. It is the better part of my treasury. Gold coins, armor and arms, plate, tripods, cauldrons, the rare gold cup, my favorite, you know the one, the Thracians gave me all those years ago, when I went on an embassy to them, all shining out as I sit on the bench beside the driver, and we travel on under the night. Then, my dear," and his voice quickens, "it is no longer night, and this time when I look behind me, what is glowing out from under the coverlet, under the wickerwork canopy, is the body of my son Hector, all his limbs newly restored and shining, restored and ransomed. And that is it," he whispers, before she can protest out of the stricken face she has turned upon him. "That is what I intend to do. To go today, immediately to Achilles, just as I saw myself in the dream, plainly dressed and with no attendant but a driver for the cart, not as a king, but as an ordinary man, a father, and offer him a ransom, and in the sight of the gods, who must surely look down in pity on me, beg him humbly on my knees, if that is what it comes to give me back the body of my son." His voice breaks and he quickly turns away. He does not dare meet her look. When he does at last, Hecuba, her eyes narrowed, is still staring at him. She nods her head, rapidly. She is, he knows, controlling herself. He must be strong now. He has always been afraid of this controlled rage in her. "And you expect him to do it?" she hisses. This scorn in her voice is withering. "You expect that jackal, that noble bully, to be moved by this touching pantomime?" She gets up and begins to stride about. The lamp flickers in the air. She stirs up, as small, straight, furious. She passes back and forth before him. "When Hector accepted Achilles' challenge, and very courteously offered him terms of combat, to allow no insult to Achilles' body if he prevailed, but to give it over in the time-honoured way, to be dealt with as the gods demand, what did the man do? He rejected the offer with contempt, and when Hector—" She paused, unable to speak the word. "When victory went to the Greek, he let his henchmen loose on our dear son's body, and 20 times over, one after another, they plunged their daggers into his flesh. Why? For what reason? To vent their spite on him? The cowards! For being what Achilles will never be, a man with no blemish on his soul, shining pure before the gods. He tied Hector's feet to the axle bar of his chariot, a thing unheard of, and dragged his body in the dust. And you expect this wolf, this violator of every law of gods and men, to take the gift you hold out to him and to act like a man?" "I do not expect it," Priam says quietly. "I believe it is possible. I believe—" And he is astonished at the enormity of the thought he is expressing. he whose whole life had been guided by what is established and conventional. Surely, he thinks, it is a goddess who is speaking through me. I believe, he says, that the thing that is needed to cut the knot that we are all tied in, something that has never before been done, is something that has never before been done or thought of, something impossible, something new. She composes herself, hoods her eyes, and sits. The assurance with which he has spoken, the quietness that is spread around them, makes her wary. She must not cross him, but the danger of what he is determined on fills her with alarm. She will need all her wiles, all her powers of firm but calm persuasion, to lead him back from it. But you would never get there, she whispers. Some swaggering lout among the Greeks would strike you down before you got even halfway to the camp. Think of it. 2 old men in a cart laden with gold. Do you suppose your grey hairs would save you? No, he admits, but the gods might, if it was their intention that I get there. Priam, she sighs, and again takes his hand. This is folly. It is, yes, I know, but what seems foolish is just what is most sensible sometimes. The fact that it has never been done, that it is novel, unthinkable, except that I have thought of it, is just what makes me believe it should be attempted. It is possible because it is not possible, and because it is simple. Why do we always think that the simple thing is beneath us? Because we are kings? What I do is what any man might do. But you are not any man. That is true. In one way I'm not, but in another, deeper way I am. I feel a kind of freedom in that. It's a feeling I like. It appeals to me. And perhaps it is unexpected. It may appeal to him too. The chance to break free of obligation of being always the hero, as I am expected always to be the king. To take the lighter bond of being simply a man. Perhaps that is the real gift I have to bring him. Perhaps that is the ransom. Hecuba shakes her head. And if you too had lost, who will stand by me when what we know is to come? Because we know both of us what that is, and can speak of it here, where there is no one else to hear it, just ourselves and the gods. Her voice has fallen to the merest breath. The flame of the lamp, too, gutters and falls. Who will share this weight of sorrow that is coming to us? And when my spirit fails, who will lend me the hand of comfort, as you do now, my dear one? Who will help keep Troy, our beloved city, alive, with at least a semblance of the old neighborliness and order of this great center and if its great center and source is gone? They sit in silence now, her hand in his. They have spoken of these things before, quietly, soberly. They are 2 old people, consulting together, seeking comfort in one another's presence. 2 children holding hands in the dark. Am I being selfish? She asks at length. But the question is to herself, and he has no answer. His voice, too, when he replies, is no more than a breath. If I do not succeed in this, and am lost, then all is lost. We must leave that to the gods, or to chance. There, and a little shiver goes through him. He has said it. Chance. She looks up quickly. Surely she has misheard. It seems to me, he says almost dreamily, that there might be another way of naming what we call fortune, an attribute to the will or the whim of the gods, which offers a kind of opening, the opportunity to act for ourselves, to try something that might force events into a different course. She wishes she had misheard. Words are powerful. They too can be the agents of what is new, of what is conceivable, and can be the thought and let loose upon the world. That Priam of all men should say such things, he who has always been so observant of what is established and lawful, makes her wonder now if his wits are not unstrung. She needs time. She needs the help of her sons. Listen, my dear, this plan of yours, if you really mean to go through with it, should be put to our sons, to Helenus and the rest, in council. That is the proper course. She allows herself a moment's pause. As for this other matter, she cannot bring herself to use his word, this idea you're so taken with, of how and why things happen as they do, that is not to be spoken of. Imagine what it would lead to, what would be permitted, the randomness, the violence. Imagine the panic it would spread. You must, I beg of you, keep that strictly to yourself. Now, I will go and give the orders to have a fire set under the cauldron and water heated for your bath. And she steps swiftly to the door and calls a servant. Priam, meanwhile, dreamily absorbed, continues to sit upright on the edge of his bed. When she returns, he is still sitting. "My dear," she says, "what is it? What more?" She is dry-eyed, intent, efficient. She has her plan now to forestall him. "Hecuba," he begins, "there is something else I want you to hear. Something that till now I have never spoken of in any of my many intimate hours we have spent together. Even to you, my dear, who knows all my doubts and foibles, and little shameful anxieties and fears. Not because I wanted to be secretive. You of all people know I am not. And anyway, you have your own sweet ways of getting around me, so what would be the use? I have not spoken of these things, because I did not know how even to begin." He shakes his head, slowly shakes it again, then composing himself, takes Hecuba's small hand and holds it close to his breast. She responds with an answering pressure of her own. She is sensitive to the slightest shades in him, but he is odd today. She has no idea where all this is leading. "You know my story," he says softly. "You must have heard it 100 times as a child in your father's palace, away there in Phrygia, long before you knew that one day you would make the journey here and be my bride." He smiles at this. The thought comforts him. It is a fact of such long standing, a story now in itself. "I wonder what you thought of it, and of me. Perhaps even then your heart was touched, and what you felt then, as a mere girl, has led to this lifetime we have spent very lovingly, I think, in one another's company." He raises her hand to his lips, meeting her concentrated, soft-eyed gaze, and glimpsing in it, as from afar, the child he has just evoked, frowning, half fearful, hanging on the story at whose midpoint his own small life was suspended. Well, it's a tale every child knows, and has heard 100 times over, from his nurse at bedtime, or from some weaver of magic in the marketplace. The beginning, the long drawn-out and terrifying business of its middle. Then, all in an instant, and what is always a surprise, even when the listener knows already what is to come, the turnabout, the happy end. However often he may have heard it, the listener sits breathless, his small soul hanging on a breath. In just a moment, a miracle will occur, and the little victim, the lost one, me in this case, will be snatched up and happily restored. Imagine then what it was like to be that child, to actually stand as I did at the center of it, of what was not a story, not yet, but a real happening, all noise and smoke and panicky confusion. To know nothing of what is to come and simply be there, one of a horde of wailing infants, some no more than 3 or 4 years old, who have been driven like geese out of the blazing citadel, along with rats, mice, and a dozen other small, terrified creatures, all squealing underfoot, a rabble of filthy, lice-ridden brats, with the mark of the whip across their shoulders, the spawn of beggars, peddlers, scullery maids, stable hands, whores, and smuggled in among them, whimpering and pale, a few little pampered lords such as I was, who'd seen their parents slaughtered, and their brothers laid out with their white throats slashed, all hiding now, smeared with shit to disguise the scent of sweet herbs on their skin, among all those others, utterly bewildered like them, and waiting too tired and hungry to be properly afraid, for some bully to come swaggering up, all matted hair and sweat, who has grown tired of slitting bellies and smashing skulls, and is ready now for a little harmless fun. Ready to amuse himself by poking ribs and pushing his thick finger into a mouth and carrying off this or that one of us to be his slave and plaything, his prize of war. We huddled in groups, half asleep on our feet. The air's an oven thick with smoke. It's past midday. Since the slaughter began, just after dawn, not a drop of water has passed our lips. Some of the smallest among us are blubbering, snot and crying for their mothers. Others are too stunned to do more than squat in their own filth. We cling together, all grimed with ashes and streaked with the dried blood of whoever it was, a parent or some kindly neighbour whose arms we were snatched from, waiting in an open now, for the men whose voices we can hear, in a great roar up there in the city, to descend like wolves and carry us off. A group of guards has been set to watch us. They are idle fellows, some of them bloodied and in bandages, all of them terrifying to a child who has never known any but men whose every move is a response to the fulfilling of his needs. Their rough voices, their hands, their red mouths scare me. They range round the edges of the crowd, pushing and shouting. Even more frightful when they produce them are their grins. Occasionally, out of boredom, or the need for a moment's savage amusement, they toss handfuls of crusts into the crowd. They laugh as their boldest or the most desperate of the mob of hungry, half-naked urchins falls upon them, scrabbling in the dirt and lashing out with knuckles and bare feet, howling, biting, gouging. The men holler and urge them on, but when their charges threaten to do one another serious mischief, we are, after all, the property of their masters, and not to be damaged. They wade in, all fists themselves, and kick the little combatants to their feet, or haul them up by their hair or the scruff of their neck, holding them like polecats, at an arm's distance, wary of teeth, then pitch them back into the mob. And I am one of these snivelling barefoot brats, 6 years old and indistinguishable, I hope. My survival depends on it. From the offspring of the lowliest scullions, I have just enough sense of the danger I am in to make myself small, so as not to attract attention. Some of those I am hiding amongst are Pallas' slaves. Any of them might point a finger and name me. Others again, just yesterday, were my playmates, little lords of all the world as I was. We avoid one another now, turn our eyes away, put the surging crowd between us. Imagine to be at one moment the little pampered darling of your father's court, never more than 20 paces from your nurse or some watchful steward, the pet of your mother's maidservants, big girls with golden half-moons or butterflies in their ears, and I like to snatch at and jingle, and of slaves who had to approach me on their knees, even when all they were doing was offering a pile of shelled walnuts, or salver, or a bowl to receive my tinkling kiss, with a skin that has never known the touch of any but the finest cotton or silk, and in winter a lamb's wool undershirt. The possessor of a sleek bay pony, and a pet rabbit, and a wicker cage the size of my fist, with a cricket in it, to drum and chirp beside my pillow. To be at one moment Podarces, son of Laomedon, king of Troy, and in the next just one of a rabble of slave children, with a smell on me that had taken till then to be the smell of another order of beings, a foul slave smell that I clung to now, in the hope that it would cling to me, since it was the only thing that could save me from drowning like my brothers up there in the citadel, in my own blood. He sits shaking his head. All this is so shameful, has for so long been secret in him. When he speaks again, it is in a voice she barely knows. Leading away from the town, and from the place below it where we were standing, waiting in the dust, is a road, narrow white, winding off across the plain, dwindling away into smoky haze. It looks quiet. It is empty as yet. I stand looking at it. That road leads to slavery. That's what I tell myself. It's the road he will drag me down, slung across his shoulders like a sheep. I look up now, and I can still see it. It's the road my other self went down, to a life where you and I, my dear, have never met, have never found one another, to a life I have lived entirely without you, and in the same body perhaps. He holds up his arm, with the same loose skin, the same ache in the knee joints and thumbs, but one that for 60 years has known only drudgery and daily humiliation and blows. And that life, too, I have lived, if only in a ghostly way, as a foul-smelling mockery of this one, that at any moment can rise to my nostrils and pluck at my robe and whisper, "So there you are, old man Podarces. There are things," he says, almost under his breath, "that once we have touched them, once they have touched us, we can never throw off. However much we scrub away at ourselves, however high the gods set us, in our nostrils the stench is still there. The old filth sticks. The smell of those others, which was my smell too, the smell of the slave's life I was being dragged away to, I can never rub off. Sometimes, late at night, when I am sliding towards sleep, and in broad daylight too, if I have been standing too long at some official ceremony, and the voice of my herald, Aeneas, has become a far-off drone in my ears, like the buzzing of flies, drunk on blood, it will be all around me, foul, close, so thick it's a wonder that others don't hold their noses and turn away. And I am back there, in the very midst of it, looking down that white dust road into another life, and it means nothing, that other story. And this one, the miraculous turnabout, has never happened, and I am just one more slave thing, like the rest, one among many. I look at my blackened hands and feet, the rags I am dressed in, and know that I have no more weight in the world than the droppings of the lowest beggar on the street sweeper. All I was promised by the poets of my father's court when they named my ancestors and sang their high dealings with the gods, all that the gods themselves promised, has been struck out, cancelled, and the little lord of all the pleasures I had taken myself to be, Podarces, son of Laomedon, is as dead as if he had choked on a sop of wine-soaked poppy cake, or one of those sweat-stained butchers had cut his throat up there along with the rest of his brothers, and he had sat down, astonished, on the palace floor, and watched his rare blood spread out across the pavement and drain away into a sluice. I take comfort from the others. Some of them are whimpering, but for the most part they are resigned. They've taken resignation in with their mother's milk. Misery is all they have known. It's what they were born to. I resign myself. I let my own old name go, since to speak it or hear it spoken would be death. I let it go, and with it that odd, old-fashioned little fellow it was tied to, who has choked on a bit of wine-soaked poppy cake, and been reborn as no one, and is waiting now, along with the rest, to be dragged out of the crowd and claimed, and heard no more. And then it happens. A breath, not my own, betrays me. "Podarces," it whispers, and I see peering at me the black eyes of my sister, Hesione, and when I shake my head and shrink back, she speaks again, louder this time. "Podarces!" Is she mad? Does she realize? Because he is at her side, hulking and dark, bare-headed, but still fully armed, his leather cuirass stained with sweat, his body pouring forth the stink of his terrible exertions. Heracles, our father's enemy. The others know him too, and draw back. I am left alone under his gaze. It will happen now, I tell myself. Doesn't she realize? I close my eyes and hold my breath. But the hero laughs. He is in a mood, it seems, to be amused. "That thing," he says, his voice is full of scorn. "You choose that? In the god's name, why?" "Because he is my brother." He frowns, leans down till his shaggy head is level with my own. The huge paw comes down, an iron clamp on my skull, and I feel his hot breath in my face, smell the rank meatiness of him, glance up, and after a moment under the brute weight of his palm. He is no longer glaring, but his smile, how easy it would be for him. Just a little more pressure of the fingertips, a turn of the hairy wrist, and my neck would snap. I meet his eyes, and see there is a lightning flicker. That is the urge to do it, because he can. "This is your brother?" he says in a wondering tone. The small pig eyes disappeared in the muscled cheeks. "You're sure it's really him?" "Of course it is," she tells him. "Wouldn't I know my own brother? Of course it's you, isn't it, Podarces, my dear?" I open my mouth, but no sound comes. "And you wouldn't try, would you," he says, my skull still locked in his grip, "to trick me with a substitute?" He leans closer. "Well," he says playfully, "my little substitute, aren't you the lucky one?" He relaxes his hold and stretches upright. He looks, in his huge bulk, rather foolish. He is trying to please her by making a game of all this. And why not? She too is just a child. She is to go, another prize of war, as a gift to his friend, Telamon. And he has told her she may have as a gift of her own, whatever she chooses, anything her bright eyes light upon, expecting her to choose some gaudy trinket, a bauble to hang at her wrist, or an ivory footstool from Punt, a bronze mirror to catch her smile in. But she is Laomedon's daughter. She has led him down to the horde of filthy, tear-stained urchins, and searched among them and chosen me. "Well," he says, in his slow mind working, "I promised you your choice. If this is what you choose, take him. Take the brat. Let him be whatever you say he is, your brother, or some nameless substitute. And what does it matter? But since he is to be my fine gift to you, and to show that I am a man of my word, let his name from now on be Priam, the price paid, the gift given to buy your brother back from the dead, so that each time he hears himself named, this is what he will recall, that till I allow you to choose him out of this filthy rabble, he was a slave like any other, a nameless thing, with no other life before him but the dirt and sweat of the slave's life, and in the secrecy of his own heart, that, for all the high titles the gods may heap on him, is the life he will go on living, day after day until his last breath." He narrows his eyes, sets his great meaty paw on my skull again, but this time with a deceptive gentleness, as if he were conferring a blessing. Priam, the price paid, the substitute and pretender, a great one of the earth, but only by default, because it pleases your fancy, little princess, to choose him, and mine to allow it. It was all mockery, you see. Young as I was, I knew mockery when I heard it. Sneering contempt, that sort of low, black, backhanded nobility, was all Heracles was capable of. After all, he was a pretender himself, only half a god, and that too by allowance and default. But his allowance was enough, little shadow that I was, of a dead prince. I caught the second breath they offered me, and was delivered, called back under a new name. The gods had relented, set back on my father's throne. I inherited his lands, his allies, married you, my dear. But a happy ending? Oh, I know what the story says. But after all those hours of being just one among so many, the one for whom no miraculous turn would come, who would go on waiting in the dust and heat, and be carried off at last to a lifetime of slavery, I did not feel I'd been delivered. I'd experienced something I could not unexperience, and would never forget. What it means for your breath to be in another's mouth, to be one of those who have no story that would ever be told. After playing with me a little, and showing me what it was to be in their power to do, The gods had relented. They would allow me, in their high-handed, half-interested way, to cough up my bit of wine-soaked poppy cake. But I had gone too far, you see, on the downward path to get back. I had the smell on me, were in my head, but also I can smell it now in my armpits and in my hands. And his fine nose wrinkles with distaste. Priam, please. Hecuba puts her fingertips to his lips. These things are so ugly. But they happen, he insists, and not just to other people. What I've been telling you happened to me. I stood in the midst of these things. He sees her shudder. She is bewildered. He has also frightened her. She resents having to be brought so close to what she does not want to know or think about. That moment of standing beside him, even in imagination, in a crowd of dirty, wailing children, the spawn, as he himself put it, of peddlers, whores, scullery maids. He should not have asked it out of her, dragging her in where she too would have that stink in her nostrils. Concealing the repugnance she feels, she once more gives him the whole of her attention, but with real fear now of his mood that he is in, and of the even darker places he may lead her into. So, he resumes, but with an irony in his tone that she recognizes. She has heard it many times before, but only now sees the force of it. I was restored. When I slipped back into my old place in the world, it was in a ghostly way, under a new name, as a substitute for that little prince Podarces, of whom nothing more would be heard or known, except that I know him. I lived the first 6 years of his life, and many times over, in the darkness of my thoughts, as he predicted, I have made my own way down into the underworld and sought him out, that small frightened child, to ask if he mightn't have some message for me, since he suffered my first death. A king, as you know, has to act in full assurance of what the gods have called him to do, his high place in the world. He acts in the realm. That too is his kingdom, of the scene. But in my case the gift was a doubtful one. It was given, then taken back again, and only in a joking left-handed way restored. In me the assurance of the inner assurance was lacking. Well, that is my affair. I have never spoken of it till now, even to you, my dear, though I expect you have sometimes wondered, and I hope that no others at least. I have given no sign that there might be this lack in me. I have always to the public view been just what I appear to be, that this is the discipline of the kings, but to achieve it I have had to go to be more rigid than others, a little too punctilious, I know, in all that is due to ceremony, a stickler, as they say, for form, for the rules, all that belongs to the outward view. But there is also an inward view, and he falls silent a moment, as if for this view there might be no words, as there is no visible form, and she must catch what she can of it, from what she can feel out in his silence. Well, as I said, none of that concerns anyone but myself, and I've tried never to let it show. It's of no account what I happen to be feeling at any moment in my actual person, whether I have the toothache, or a belly swollen from eating too many peaches, or am raging with anger, or impatience, or desire, so long as I sit still and fill a space towards which others may look in reverence. So long, I mean, as I create the proper illusion. Only I know what it costs to be such an object, to rattle about like a pea in the golden husk of my dazzling eminence, never for a moment to wobble or look flustered, or let the impressive effect be shaken by so many as the twitching of an eyelid, or, God forbid, a yawn, or in these later days of my old age, by the trembling of a hand. I've played my part, and tried to let nothing peep out of the real man inside, so much empty shining. I did it out of defiance for the gods, as well as in fearful reverence for them, in defence of the fact that their first choice all those years ago was against me, as perhaps they have chosen against me a second time in this business of the war. so that I have now to be ransomed a second time, to ransom myself as well as my son, by going to Achilles, not in a ceremonial way, as my symbolic self, but stripped of all glittering distractions and disguises, as I am. He sits with his hands clasped between his knees, suddenly weary. Hecuba, too, is silent. At last she sets her hand very gently on his shoulder and says, "For the moment, we'll speak no more of this. You go to your bath now. In the meantime, I'll send a servant to summon our sons, and the wiser of your counselors. Explain your plan to them. Let us see what they have to say of it." An hour later Priam's sons, his many daughters and their husbands, and all his counselors and advisers, are gathered in the inner court of the palace. They are abuzz, puzzled by the novelty of the late morning summons, and the news that the king has an announcement to make. Only 9 of the royal princes are Hecuba's sons. The rest, among them 1 or 2 of Priam's favourites, are the sons of other princesses, or they are bastards, though all bear the title of prince. Once there was a full 50 of them. Those that remain, save for Helenos, who is a dedicated priest, are what Priam, in his more critical mood, calls heroes of the table and the dance, plump and soft-bellied, most of them, with the exquisite manners of the courtier, and the courtier's eye for the failings of others, along with a very practical talent for dropping into their father's ear the innocent fact or fiction that will do their rivals harm. For they are divided, these princes, even with a common enemy at the gate, into factions, all very watchful of one another. Only part of this has to do with the court politics. The rest arises from the rivalry of their wives. Eager now to see what sort of mood their father is in, they turn as usual to Hecuba. She enters and immediately begins whispering to Helenos. A bad sign, this. Then moves as a diversion from one to another of the wives, careful as always to give each one of them the same cool but unaffected attention. The wives are afraid of her, and it amuses the princes, who know their mother and her ways, that women who at home can be demanding, even intractable, go to water when this small straight-backed woman puts her disconcerting questions, giving no indication in her smile of what she might be thinking of the reply. Today Helenos too is on the move, consulting briefly with Phoebus, leading Sir Polydamas aside, and looking back over his shoulder to see which of the others may be watching. Meanwhile Priam stands isolated and very nearly forgotten, till Polydamas, who is still a little more than a child, a high-coloured, athletic boy with the coal-black tresses and eyebrows that meet in the middle, launches boldly forward and greets his father very warmly and unself-consciously with a kiss, which Priam, when he recovers, returns. The others, one after another, follow, greeting their father and receiving his blessing, though they do not, like Polydamas, kiss him. At least outwardly, respectfully, they set themselves to listen. But when they hear with growing alarm what the old man has in mind, they are filled with a misgiving that swells, as the questions spread among them, to outright consternation. How has he got a hold of such a notion? It contradicts everything they have ever known of this grave and cautious figure who is their father, challenges all they have ever demanded of the man, father or not, who is their king. A king whose stable is the envy of every prince in the known world does not ride in a wagon drawn by mules. A king does not, in his own person, negotiate and deal. He has a herald to do that for him, in a voice that is skilled and trumpet-like, professionally trained in the laying down of challenges and making of proclamations. They turn from one to the other, all astir and eager to protest. But no one among them is willing to brave their father's temper and be the first man to speak. It is Phoebus, the most smooth-mannered and eloquent of them, who steps forward at last. "My dear lord," he begins, "you know what my brother Hector meant to me, how close we were, how out of all my brothers, he was the dearest to me, as I believe I was to him. There is no danger I would not face or bring him home to your house, my lord, and to my poor mother's arms. Yes, yes, Priam thinks, that is all very well, but what have you done more than the rest? Beat your breast, fouled your hair with earth, wept a little? You are young and hardy. Even an old man like me can do that much. Sir, Deiphobus resumes, Father, this plan of yours is not only new and unheard of, it not only puts your precious life at risk, it also exposes to insult. And this, I know, you value every bit as much as life itself, your royal image. Do you really imagine that a man who has no respect for the body of his enemy, for the laws of honourable behaviour before men and the gods, who is in the frenzy of his pride and wrath, his madness, daily violates the corpse of the noblest hero our world has known, that such a man would not take delight in hauling down your kingly image and dragging that too in the dust? And what then of all you hold in custody? The sacred spirit of our city, the lives of each one of us. I say nothing of the treasure you will be carrying. That is mere earth stuff, metal, however finely worked. It is dispensable. You, my lord, are the treasure we cannot allow to be lost. You are what matters to us. So you have for the whole of your life been a king. Ordinary desires and needs and feelings are not unknown to you. I know that. You are my father, but you can have, in all your kingly role, no part in them. You are not in your royal sphere. And are you now to wring Achilles' heart by appealing to those very feelings of the ordinary man that has been the whole business of your life to remain aloof from? I beg you, sir, be patient like the rest of us. Can you really believe that Hector, who is so proud, who loved you and cared so much for your royal dignity, and fought and poured his life out to preserve it, would thank his father for clasping the knees of his killer in a merely human way, and laying all the glory of Troy in the dust? He would weep, my lord, as I do. And at this, Deiphobus, unable to go on, dashed the tears from his eyes and turns away. Priam lowers his head. When he raises it again, his look is grave, but his eyes, for all the power of emotion in him, are dry. Deiphobus, you speak to me as a son, and I am sorry if what I have in my head to do offends or shames you. I have had a good 60 years now to consider the splendour and limitations of what it is to be king. You speak too as a brother. I know how much you loved Hector, and how deeply affected you have been by the loss of a man we all cherished and depended on. You ask me to stand, as I have always done, at the kingly distance from the human, which in my kingly role, as you say, I can have no part in. But I am also a father. Mightn't it be time for me to expose myself at last to what is merely human, to learn a little of what might be, and what it is to bear it as others do? I know I am an old man, feeble in body, and ill-equipped to go venturing out, at this late date, into a world of change and accident. But as you know, I am also stubborn, and I have not survived this long without a certain degree of toughness. Perhaps this, and he glances quickly at Hecuba's direction, is the time to show it. Cassandra is there, pale and distracted-looking, only half attentive. Her brothers turn to her now, in the hope that their father, who is fond of the poor deluded creature, will listen to her. But Cassandra has nothing to say. Her god has withdrawn. He no longer visits and inflames her. Numb with grief for her brother Hector, she feels only a dulled indifference to what is happening around her, even to what is happening or about to happen to herself, as if it had already occurred, and too long ago now to be of any consequence. When her brothers look toward her, those brothers who once mocked her searing visions, she shakes her head and remains dumb. At last, since no one else seems willing to speak, Polydamas comes forward, not one of Priam's sons, or even a son-in-law, but one of the wisest of the Trojans. My lord Priam, he begins, you know the reverence and the great affection in which I hold you. Firstly, on my friend Hector's account, because I thought of him always as a brother, and of you, therefore, as a second father. even more because of the whole of my life what I have chiefly cared for is order, and for as long as I have experienced of the world, you have been the great upholder of order among us. None more pious, none more punctilious in what is owed to the gods, but also to us your subjects, who look to you as the fountainhead of all that keeps Troy civil and just. But that, my lord, is the limit of what we have the right to ask, and all that the gods too can demand. They made you a king. A proper kingliness of spirit and presence is all they or we can require of you, my lord, and all in these sad times that you need properly ask of yourself. I beg you, spare yourself this ordeal. Do not, for the affection we all bear you, expose yourself to the hazards of war and of the road, or to the indignities that Achilles and any other Greek who happens along might heap upon you. Be kind in your old age. Relieve yourself of this unnecessary task. Priam considers the man. He is pleased with what Polydamas has said, pleased too that it offers him something to say in return that will make clearer his reasons for what he is determined on. Thank you, Polydamas. You are generous in your tribute, but I am grateful. What you have to say of order and kingliness does you credit. If I reject your advice, it is not because I do not value it. I do, and I value you, not least because you are my son's dear friend, and I know he loved and listened to you. It is true that the gods made me a king, but they also made me a man and a mortal, gave me life and all that comes with it, all that is sweet, but all that is terrible too, since only what we know we must lose is truly sweet to us. The gods themselves know nothing of this, and in this respect perhaps may envy us, but not in the end, because in the end what we come to is what time, with every heartbeat and in every moment of our lives, has been slowly working toward us, the death we have been carrying in us from the beginning, from our first breath. Only we humans can know, endowed as we are with mortality, but also with conscientiousness, of what it is to be aware each day of the fading in us, the freshness and youth, and falling away as the muscles grow slack in our arms, the thigh grows hollow, and the sight dims of whatever manly vigour we were once endowed with. While all that happens, it is what it means to be a man and a mortal, and as men we accept it. Less easy to accept is what follows from it. One day war comes, and what the moment demands is strength of nerve and sinew, quickness of eye and foot and hand. An old man has no part to play then but that of a bystander or a passive looker-on, and if all goes badly, if the citadel falls, and the killers come pouring through the streets, men whose blood is a roaring lion in them, who go raging from house to house looking for women and children to destroy, and feeble old men, old bystanders and lookers-on to run down and slaughter, it will mean nothing to them, nothing at all, if one of these feeble old men happens also to be a king. When the dogs claw at one another's backs in their frenzy to get to their entrails, when they gnaw at the skull of this misshapen feet, and tear without shame at the old man's private parts, the source of so many noble sons and daughters, one of the chief concerns of a good king is the image he presents, and most of all, as he grows older, the image that other men will keep of him when he is gone. That is what I am concerned with. Now, in these last days of my kingship, I cannot stop what may be about to occur, that I leave as I must to the gods. If the last thing that happens to me is to be hunted down in the heart of my citadel, and dragged out by the feet, and shamelessly stripped and humiliated, so be it. But I do not want that to be the one sad image of me that endures in the minds of men. The image I mean to leave is a living one, of something so new and unheard of, that when men speak of my name, it will stand forever as proof that I was an act in these terrible days, that even an old man can perform, that only an old man can dare perform, of whom nothing now can be expected, of noise and youthful swagger, who can go humbly as a father and as a man to his son's killer, and ask in the gods' name and in their sight to be given back the body of his dead son, lest the honour of all men be trampled in the dust. Priam's voice breaks, and he turns aside to hide his tears. Hecuba's hand is there to steady him. The rest are too moved, and they see, as Hecuba does, that there is no point in further argument. Foolish as the old man's plan may be, they can only reconcile themselves and let him have his way. It is early afternoon now. Priam, already attired in the plain white robe of his vision, with Hecuba beside him, and his head nodding a little, is seated under an awning in the open courtyard. He is waiting while Hippothous and Dios, two of the royal princes, supervise the getting ready of a cart. Helenus has been dispatched to assemble the precious objects he will take from his treasury, the cauldrons, tripods, armour, and the rest, that will make up Hector's ransom. At last, with a buzz of approval from the crowd, Hippothous and Dios reappear, and the four-wheeled cart is trundled in. A fine new one, the marks of the adze still visible in its timbers. The 12-spoked wheels are elaborately carved and painted. A wickerwork canopy covers the tray. All is of the most ingenious design and intricate workmanship. Behind, attended by two grooms, walks the king's herald Aeneas, plainly but splendidly attired, bearing the royal staff, and with him, in an impressive cavalcade, Priam's ceremonial chariot, with two thoroughbred horses between the shafts, elegant, high-stepping creatures, all liquid muscle and nerve, their manes plaited with thread of gold. Priam is immediately enraged. He leaps from his seat, and the princes, who know what he is when he is roused, draw back. "Are you deaf?" he shouts. "Did not one of you hear me when I spoke? Or am I so old and feeble now that you no longer feel obligated to take the least notice of what I say? I asked for a cart, an ordinary mule cart, not this carnival wagon. You have done this because you are still thinking in the old way. I told you, I tried to tell you, that my vision was of something new. Now this time, listen. Go down to the marketplace and find me a common work cart, such as a man might carry logs in, or fired bricks, or a load of hay." The mule should be strong, the driver too, but nothing more is required. No chariot, no horses. I will ride in the cart on the crossbench beside the driver. Now this time, bring what I have asked for. I won't ask again." So it is that there appears in the palace courtyard, not long after, a stocky fellow, 50 or so, bull-shouldered, shock-headed, with a countryman's spade-shaped beard, rough-cut, and of an iron-grey colour. A carter with a reputation among the market people for being reliable enough, but when he has had a drink or two, a bit of a madcap, and the owner of two strong black mules. His name is Somax. The princes, who found the man waiting in the marketplace to be hired, have assured him he has committed no wrong. It is not for that reason they are bringing him in, but he is apprehensive, just the same, when they lead him, in his homespun robe and broken sandals, to the palace yard where so many royal persons are assembled. A plain workman, but he has had no experience till now of princes. He is dazzled by the cleanliness, the whiteness of everything here, the arms, necks, faces of the women, and some of the men too, who look as if they've never seen sunlight. The columns, the walls of polished stone, the pavement with not a straw in sight, the plump-breasted, fan-tailed doves that go strutting around the fountain in a formal way, as if they'd been trained to do it, dipping their beaks into its pool. He is surprised, too, by the tallness of these Trojans, and their voices, which are thin and high-pitched, unlike his own, and those of the folk he lives among. He hangs his head and studies the pavement between his feet. He is here, he knows, not for himself, but because of his mules, and especially the smaller of the two, which, the moment they entered the marketplace, caught the eye of one of the princes, as she does everyone's. She is such a plain charmer. A little black thing, strong in the withers, but also dainty. Her winning nature has much to do with her intelligence, which is there for all to see, and with the fact that she notices people and responds in such a lively way to their interest. Beauty, he calls her, and he has raised her up himself, coaxing the sweet talking her, rewarding her with tidbits from his palm, scratching the downy ears and whispering his small secrets to her. In the tavern, where he goes to enjoy a little company, to hear a joke or two, and to escape the lightheadedness and harshness of his life, he talks so warmly and so often of his little mule that he is teased for it, with all sorts, of course, but joking suggestions. And it is true, he is a little in love with the creature. So it is the mule has brought him here, and because of her that he now stands in the royal palace in a courtyard crowded with princes and their ladies, and rather fearful under the gaze of what might be expected of him. He does not recognize at first the spare old fellow, very plainly dressed in a white robe, who gets up out of a chair, comes close, and subjects him to scrutiny. He has seen King Priam only at a distance, an imposing figure, long-boned and tall, standing very straight and stiff in his chariot. Never face to face like this. He is surprised how old he looks, how sunken and deeply scored the cheeks, and deeply set in their sockets, and milky pale the eyes under their straggle of white brows. "So," Priam says at last, "they have explained to you what we are to do?" The man nods. He does not know how he should address the king, and is conscious, among so many lilting and lisping, of his own harsh-sounding gutturals. He glances for help to the two princes, who frown but nod. "They have?" he ventures. "I am to drive to the Greek camp." The king draws closer. The carter thinks he might be taking a whiff of him. He shifts uncomfortably, and lifts his shoulders in the looseness of his robe. His nose itches, and he has a powerful urge to rub it, but resists. All this, he thinks, along with his smell, the old man, who has come very close now, is taking into account and judging. At last, with no change of expression, the king turns and faces the princes. "I like the look of this fellow," he announces in a good clear voice, and all the members of the court take a second look at him and clap their hands, but in a restrained and formal way, with a sound so pitter-pat small that the pigeons are barely disturbed in their dipping and promenading. The man Somax is inclined to chuckle, but he restrains himself. "Likes the look of me, does he? Well, there's something." He thinks of what his cronies at the tavern would have to say of this. At the same moment one of the princes makes a gesture, and with a grinding and creaking that is quite out of place among so many subdued voices, and the gurgling and cooing of the pigeons, his cart is wheeled in. The mules prick their ears at the sight of him, and he immediately feels more securely himself, more solidly at home in his body, and lighter in spirit for their presence. Priam, meanwhile, has been regarding this rough-looking fellow who is to be the sole companion of his journey, and is confirmed once again in the rightness of his project. The carter resembles so completely the figure of his dream. For the whole half-century of his kingship, the herald who has attended Priam on all ceremonial occasions, to carry the royal staff and raise his voice and speak for him when his speech is required, has been the old Dardanian name of Aeneas, though whether the man who appeared at his side was at every point the same Aeneas, he has never found the need to ask. It is the office and name that matters, not the person, and it is the light of his identification of name, and it is in the light of this identification of name with office and the continuity of the office in the name that Priam, who has already made one bold decision, is led now to another. He turns to the carter, and in a voice that is meant to be intimate rather than peremptory, but loud enough for the whole company to hear, announces, "One other thing I am accustomed, on all occasions when I leave my palace, is to have a herald with me. He is called Aeneas. Since you will be my only companion on this journey, that is how I will think of you, and how you, my man, should think of yourself. From now on, your name is Aeneas." The carter glances about him, believing there must be something here that he has failed to grasp. He shuffles, rubs his nose vigorously with the heel of his hand, looks up under his wrinkled brows, in the hopes that he may catch some clue from the reaction of the crowd. There is stirring among the princes of subdued unease. Once again this readiness of their father's part to change on a whim what has been for so long fixed and accepted, dismays them. As for the carter, who is quite out of his depth now, and wonders what further madness these high folk will demand of him, what can he do but drop his head and mutter very low and without much enthusiasm, "Very well, sir. Right, my lord." But in fact it is not very well with him, not at all. His name is Somax. It fits him. He has always thought rather well. He has been comfortable with it, warm and very much himself, for a good 50 years, give or take a little. It guarantees the breath that passes in and out of his mouth. It is an assurance, after a good night's sleep, that the spirit that has left his body and gone wandering off to all sorts of places will find its way back to the particular pile of straw where he is lying, and be recognized and taken in. It is the name under which he married his dear one, and became the father of 5 children, none of them, alas, now living, and under which he has always conducted himself, so far as a poor man can, honestly, and kept himself in a good odour with all the gods. Will they recognize him, he wonders, under this new one? Aeneas, indeed! Mightn't they take it amiss, those high ones, that after 50 years under one denomination, he should suddenly present himself under another? Mightn't they see it as a kind of presumption, this juggling with the high dignity of heralds and such, this taking on of Aeneas, by such a plain low-born fellow? He shuffles, feels a crawling under his robe, as if all his lice had been stirred up, and were on the move. Something about the life he has lived all these years, the hardships, the losses he has suffered, and the way he has forced himself to go on and endure, is being set aside and made light of. That is what he feels. So when the royal princes, in their affected tones, and with their deference so out of proportion to his real status that it can only, he thinks, be a form of subtle mockery, with an Aeneas this, and my dear Aeneas that, begin to make requests and give orders, he feels increasingly uneasy, and then sullenly affronted. Perhaps he is wrong, and no offence is intended. They are simply acting in accordance with their father's odd wishes, and however foolish and effeminate they may appear, this is the way they always speak. But he smoulders just the same, and in spirit at least clenches his fists. He steadies himself by turning to his mules, who stand patient amid so much fluster, waiting for him, in the usual way, to give some indication of when they should move. Beauty the one is called, and the other Shock, though there is no reason why any one there should know this, and he decides in a spirit of quiet resistance to keep these names to himself. Meanwhile piles of treasure are being brought in, copper cauldrons and tripods, ewers, urns, cups, ceremonial arms and armour. Some of it, the cauldrons for instance, so weighty that it takes 2 servants to heave the pieces up onto the tray. Slowly the wagon, which has known nothing till now, as the driver could tell them, but winter wood, or hides, or stacks of forage, is tight packed with precious objects. To the watchers, as the treasure is assembled, piece by piece, it is as if what is taking shape there in all its shining parts is a body, that of their dear kinsman Hector, for which in their hearts, filled now with the hope that comes from wishing, the hoard has already been exchanged. At last, when all is done, Hecuba sends her steward for a jar of clear spring water and a cup of wine, for a drink offering. She herself takes the ewer from her steward's hand, and when Priam has turned back the sleeves of his pure white robe, sprinkled his fingers and dried them in a cloth, she hands him the cup, and he prays aloud, raising his face to where the gods in their high court will be looking on. He allows a few drops of the mellow wine to spill onto the pavement, and prays again. The carter, peering up from under his brows, is impressed by the solemnity of the occasion, but the moment lasts too long. His nose begins to itch. At last the tension breaks, and someone notices. High up under thin clouds, a bird hanging with wings extended in the blue. The carter thinks. A chicken hawk, riding the updraft and hanging there on the lookout for a field mouse in the furrows below, or a venturesome hamster or vole. But prompted by his mother, the priest Helenus proclaims it an eagle. The carter is surprised at this, though no one else appears to be. The whole assembly raises its eyes, and the murmur that fills the court is one of wonder and relief. Clear for all to see, Jove's emblem and messenger is hovering there, holding them, these mighty representatives of Troy, and the many thousands of people outside the palace, in the city and in the villages and provinces beyond, in a quivering net of its celestial attention and concern. Each day at first light, the people of Troy crowd the ramparts of the city, the colonnade before the Scaean gate, and the broad streets leading to the central square, to watch the Trojan army, with shields newly polished, and breastplates and helmets flashing, march to the field. The passing of this or that hero among them occasions cheers. Some of the little girls in the crowd have gathered flowers and rush forward to pelt their favourites. There is laughter as vivid red petals splatter a warrior's breast. The air is just heating, and the men sweat inside their leather, but step out briskly in close order. The day is new, and still to be won. Then in the shadows of the late afternoon, in the same numbers, but more quietly now, until the stillness is broken by the shrieks of some wife or mother, the crowd assembles for a second time to see their defenders, all streaked with sweat and dust, or in bandages and bleeding, troop home. Some too many, lie on pallets, borne by their squires or comrades, groaning, or already stiff in death. Others, propped up on one elbow, call to their family or to friends and neighbours in the crowd, "See, I am alive, I am still living," or with teeth clenched in silent pain. They clasp the hand of a wife or child, who walks half laughing, half weeping at their side. All this till 11 days ago, when Hector was slain, and all fighting between the two sides was suspended. Now, at 3 in the afternoon, news spreads from yard to yard and stall to stall in the swarming market that a procession is gathering at the palace gate. Labourers in neat skin aprons, with a hammer at their belt, call down the scaffolding of the buildings that they are at work on, and point, for through the city stands and has stood for nearly 10 years now on the brink of destruction. New houses are still being built and old ones repaired or added to. In spite of alarms and many deprivations and shortages, the life of the city goes on. Linen is still spread to dry on quince trees or rosemary bushes. Hives have to be visited each day and honey gathered from dripping racks. Cats have to be set to keep mice out of granaries, and the cellars, where oil jars are kept, pine logs trimmed and stacked in piles against the winter, trenches dug and cisterns maintained, so that the autumn rain, when it comes, pelting, will not run off the sides of the bluff, along which the city is spread. Magistrates, sweating in the late afternoon heat, have still to bear witness and to endure the long-winded addresses of rival advocates in a case of assault or murder, since even under threat from a common enemy, citizens still harbour grudges and pursue with undiminished bitterness long-standing quarrels or vendettas, and wars still break out among neighbours over the most trivial affronts. But today all this busy activity comes to a halt. Crowds race through the streets and push for a place on the city walls. Boys leave off their arm wrestling and their games of jackstones or tag, and scramble out between the legs of their elders to be in the front row of spectators among the greybeards and pickpockets, idlers and loungers of every sort, women with a child on their hip and another in hand that they drag along howling, Sellers of perfume, sellers of pickles, sellers of fried grasshoppers and of almonds still soft in their velvety green shells, prosperous shopkeepers and their wives, who have set a reluctant assistant to watch over their wares while they bustle fat and breathless to the nearest vantage point. Just on three, a cart drawn by two black mules and driven by a man the whole town recognizes as a simple carter, Somax, the son of Astrogen, lumbers slowly out of the palace gates and downhill toward the square. On the crossbench beside the driver, very stiff-looking in a plain white robe, sits the king, Priam, severely upright and with no fillet on his brow, no staff in his hand, no amulet or armband. On either side of the cart, and in rows behind, sauntering along in a casual way, and when the cart slows or comes to a halt, stumbling a little as they crowd in one against the next, come the king's remaining sons. Helenus, Paris, the crowd names them as they pass, Agathon, Diphoebus, and Antiphonus, Dius, Pamon, Hippothous, and the youngest of all the royal princes, the boy Polydamas. The mules pull and sweat. The cart is heavy. Some heaped up load covered by a cloth is in the tray. The driver is anxious. He makes more fuss than seems strictly necessary about negotiating the cartwheels over the big cobbles. Priam, like the statue of himself at the entrance of the temple, sits stiff and square, his gaze fixed rigidly ahead. It is such an unaccustomed sight, so sober, so stripped of all finery and show, that the crowd, for all its high spirits, does not know how to react. No one thinks it is appropriate to cheer. Is the city's wealth being taken to safety somewhere deep in the country? Is the king deserting them? They watch the cart stop before the high wooden gate, see the bar raised, hear the great locks snap. From the walls, the crowd, buzzing now with excited speculation, watches the procession wind downhill to the stone trough among riven pines where in the old days, before the war, the Trojan women used to go to steep their washing in the spring. Then on the lookout with its lawn wind-swept fig, here the little group breaks up. The cart lurches on, and with Jove's eagle sitting high above, takes a high road that leads out across the plain. The royal princes, singly or in groups, turn back and make their way, bend after dog-legged bend, uphill. Whatever it was is over, or, mysteriously, has just begun.